The 2 million acres of Yellowstone National Park is the most unique location in the world. Located in the northwest corner of Wyoming, it is just north of the Grand Teton National Park. Although a major portion of these two parks are open only for less than half a year, they are still among the most visited parks in the world. It is hard to imagine a more spectacular place for a bike ride. In September 2014, members of the Fogby Bicycle Club laid out a 400-mile ride, starting at Jackson, Wyoming, pedaling through both parks, and looping back through Montana and Idaho to Jackson. While in the parks, they plan to stay in cabins provided by the Park Service. Although the common joke was, who would be the last to outsprint a grizzly bear, they were more concerned about the high elevation and the risk for hypoxia. The parks were above 6,000 feet, and at two locations, Dunraven Pass and Teton Pass, the road rose to nearly 9,000 feet. Bicyclists were Ann and Ben Cowan from Bristol, Tennessee, Bruce Day, Tom Evans, and Andrew Getter from Hendersonville, Tennessee, Dean Retzlaff from Louisville, Kentucky, Brian and Nicole Shoemaker, and of course, they'll always remember Dave Shoemaker from Hendersonville. All were indebted to the fine support of Alicia Shoemaker, Sharon Evans, and Wilma Day. Everyone met at the Elk Refuge Motel on the day prior to the start of the adventure. Located about a mile north of Jackson, Wyoming, it was on the bike trail connecting the town to Grand Tetons National Park. The first day plan was to ride 45 miles from Jackson to Coulter Bay Village, stopping at the park entrance in Moose to watch a movie in a visitor center, having lunch at Dornan's Chuck Wagon, riding the bike trail to Jenny Lake, and then riding the road to Coulter Bay. Instead of using the bike trail out of Jackson, the route was on a more scenic and pastoral road alongside the mountain behind the motel. However, before starting the adventure, the group needed a picture with the iconic symbol of Jackson, the Antler Arch. This $350,000 gem was near our motel. The road out of Jackson had almost no traffic and some great views of the mountains. After 8 miles and just south of the Jackson Hole Airport, the route joined up with the main bike trail out of Jackson. The paved bike trail ran for the next 7 miles to the park entrance. With the bright sunny sky, with the temperatures hovering around 60 degrees, and with spectacular views of the Teton Mountains, this trip was already exceeding everyone's expectations. Have a bison burger at Dornan's Chuck Wagon. It was a small resort located on the Snake River just inside the entrance to the park. Relax or shop, Dornan's had 2 restaurants, grocery and deli stores, gasoline, ATM, guest lodging, and adventure sports equipment rental and sales. The eastern front of the Teton Range was approximately 40 miles long and rose around 7,000 feet from the valley floor. Unlike most mountain ranges, this side lacked foothills which would obscure the view. Grand Teton at 13,770 feet was the highest peak. The paved bike trail in the park was 10 miles long and ended at scenic Jenny Lake. The remaining 20 miles to Coulter Bay Village was on the road, but that was no problem. It had a great 6-foot wide shoulder and light traffic. Coulter Bay Village on the northeast side of Jackson Lake was a complete resort with a general store, laundry facilities, lodging, restaurants, and a wide variety of recreational facilities. It offered a variety of lodging options, with the most popular being the cabins. These authentic and refurbished Jackson Hole homestead log cabins were spacious and comfortable. The Ranch House restaurant was a great place to refuel and share the first day's experience. On day 2, the group was leaving the Grand Tetons and entering Yellowstone. With a 5:45 dinner reservation, 60 miles to ride, and a lot to see, it was a tight schedule. The first stop was at Moose Falls, then unexpectedly a bike chain jammed at the top of the first climb. Lunch was at Grant Village, the first volcano action was viewed at West Thumb, and finally, dinner and sacking out was at Yellowstone Lake Lodge. The roads out of Teton continued to be good with decent shoulders and light traffic. There wasn't a lot to see but the forest and Jackson Lake. After 18 miles, we entered Yellowstone. In Yellowstone, the roads were narrow, rarely had any shoulder, and the traffic was greater. Just imagine a Chinaman on your tail in a rented RV. About a mile from the entrance was Moose Falls. This 30-foot-high waterfall on Crawfish Creek was named in 1885 by members of the Arnold Hague Geological Survey for the plentiful moose found there. They were gone by the time we got there. At the top of our first climb, we had an unscheduled rest stop. A chain jammed between the spokes and the cassette. It took about 30 minutes of wrestling and a half dozen pairs of hands to get it free. Grant Village was our lunch stop. We grabbed sandwiches and picnic at the general store. West Thumb, with its boiling mud ponds, was the first sign that we were riding atop of a not-so-dormant volcano. We couldn't visit too long. It was 3 o'clock, and we still had 20 miles to pedal. Our cabins at Yellowstone Lake were not as nice as Coulter Bay. They were smaller and located in an open gravel-covered field. The third day was our toughest. We had a lot of touring and 55 miles to cover over some challenging terrain. To make matters worse, motor traffic on the narrow shoulderless road between the lake and Yellowstone Falls was heavy. Until we got to Mud Volcano, we were pulling off every 5 minutes to let long lines of trucks, RVs, and cars pass. Fortunately, buffalo jams held up the tourists more than we. Yellowstone Falls and the canyon were spectacular and crowded with thousands of tourists. We lunched at Canyon Village and then made our way to the 9,000-foot-high Dunraven Pass. From here it was a 10-mile downhill glide to Tower Falls. The last 20 miles to Mammoth were a bitch, with seemingly non-ending series of pucks. Mud Volcano mimicked West Thumb. It had a half-dozen boiling mud ponds and a serpentine boardwalk crowded with tourists. The Grand Canyon of Yellowstone, with its waterfall, was every bit as fantastic as the Big Bertha in Arizona, but on a smaller scale. The lower falls are 308 feet high, or almost twice as high as Niagara Falls. The width of Yellowstone River before it goes over the lower falls is 70 feet. The Grand Canyon of Yellowstone is approximately 24 miles long, between 800 and 1,200 feet deep, and from 1/4 to 3/4 of a mile wide. Although trappers and prospectors had knowledge of the canyon, the first descriptions weren't publicized until after the Cook, Folsom, Peterson expedition of 1869. When Charles Cook first viewed the canyon, he wrote, "I remember seeing what appeared to be an opening in the forest ahead, which I presumed to be a park or open country. While my attention was attracted by the pack animals, which had stopped to eat grass, my saddle horse suddenly stopped. I turned and looked forward, and from the brink of a great canyon, at the point just across from what is now Inspiration Point, I sat there amazed while my companions came up, and after that it seemed to me that it was 5 minutes before anyone spoke."
Dunraven Pass. The boys coming up after a 5-mile climb. Hey. According to my GPS, this is Dunraven Pass.
The climb to 9,000 feet at Dunraven Pass had us all concerned about oxygen deprivation. Bruce said, "This is the highest I have ever been without being in an airplane." But none of us experienced any shortness of breath. It was the 10-mile long, screaming downhill with its switchbacks, absence of pull-offs, and impatient motorists that was a greater concern. Those with rim brakes had to stop several times to let their wheels cool so as not to incur a blowout. Tower Falls Campground with this general store marked the end of the descent. Tower Falls was just behind the general store and was the second most popular natural feature in the park. The 132-foot drop of Tower Creek, framed by eroded volcanic pinnacles, inspired Thomas Moran, whose painting was crucial in the making Yellowstone as a natural park in 1872. Bruce, however, found another falls just up the road that he liked.
Here we have the falls. Here we have the falls just before we get to Mammoth Hot Springs. To me, they're the prettiest ones so far. We've gone through some really gorgeous country today. But the fact that the climbs were a lot harder than I expected didn't help.
Thanks to a series of never-ending pucks, the last of our crew didn't struggle in until 7 o'clock. The hotel in Mammoth was one hell of a welcome sight. The rooms are comfortable with space for 2 queen-size beds, but not for a bathroom. That was down the hall. Just up the road from the hotel were the hot springs. Visiting them would have to wait until tomorrow. As viewed from the top of Mammoth Hot Springs, one can see the small town that has grown up to service this unique natural feature. Oblivious to the 2-legged visitors, elk were commonly seen roaming the grounds. The 4th day route received a lot of discussion. The upward climb on the road just south of Mammoth was narrow, winding, and not bicycle friendly. To make matters worse, at 20 miles the road was under construction and closed to bicycles. The group wanted to spend time touring Mammoth Hot Springs and Norris Geyser Basin. Each was likely to require at least an hour. Unfortunately, due to dinner reservations at 5:15 at Old Faithful, the schedule was again tight. Ann and Ben had already made up their minds. They were riding regardless. They felt they could hitch a ride through the construction zone. The rest of the group decided to tour the hot springs and then get ferried with bike on van to Norris. Here they had a picnic lunch before riding to Old Faithful. Bruce stood in front of Minerva Terrace, the most famous feature at the springs. It was part of a large complex of hot springs on a hill of travertine created thousands of years ago as 170-degree water traveled 20 miles from Norris Geyser Basin via a limestone fault line. As the spring bubbled to the surface, it deposited calcium carbonate. Algae living in the warm pools tinted the travertine with shades of brown, orange, red, and green.
We're almost to the top of Mammoth Hot Springs Boardwalk. Looks like we missed the very prettiest part where we hit the White Rocks by maybe an hour or 2. Stinks of sulfur up here. hotel way off in the distance. Mountains all around.
The road north of Norris was not suitable for bicycles. Ann and Ben hitched a ride on the Pilot pickup truck. Norris Geyser Basin was the hottest geyser basin in the park and located on the intersection of three major faults, one of which experienced a 7.8 earthquake in 1959. It was on the fracture zone that resulted from the creation of the Yellowstone caldera 640,000 years ago. There were 193 geysers at Norris, including the tallest active geyser in the world, the 300-foot-high Steamboat Geyser. Unfortunately, unlike its cousin, Old Faithful, Steamboat had an erratic and lengthy timetable between major eruptions, which were typically separated by intervals of more than a year. In between, it teased visitors with minor eruptions of approximately 40 feet. Norris had no food services, so we had a picnic lunch just outside the Basin Museum.
Here we are at the Steamboat Geyser. Okay, that last geyser was actually Veterans Geyser, not Steamboat Geyser. Now we're going into another geyser. Vixen Geyser. Here we are at the Minute Geyser. We'll give it about.
The 500-acre Old Faithful complex was a small city whose population increased by nearly 1,000 people as the parking lots filled up and then emptied approximately once every hour to witness the blowing of the geyser that made it famous. Our abode for the evening was a small cabin on the edge of the complex. It was comparable to the Yellowstone Lake cabin. We had a 5:15 dinner reservation in the inn, which necessitated that we wait until the next morning to view the blowing of Old Faithful.
We didn't have seats, we all had a stand.
Yeah, but you don't want to sit on these.
Nope.
There's a seat for you to
Uh-huh.
watch it? Yeah. Well, how cool. They're wet, but, you know, everything else we do up for.
You're smoking now. It goes way.
Well, I'm feeling like because there might still be, you know, but I'm sure we can't still fuel on that.
No, we walked. And there were,
Yeah.
there was none of them.
Well, they prayed that people would, you know.
Well, the thing is, too, they
Get
were
We're coming right back to you.
there. That's what we saw last night.
Oh, yeah. It is pretty impressive.
The plan for the day was a 32-mile ride to West Yellowstone. there was a lot of time to tour the geyser basins in this region of the park. Midway Geyser Basin, with its 59 active geysers, was the most popular and was our first stop. The lesser-known Firehole Lake area offered an opportunity to get up close, and more importantly, it was off-limits to RVs and buses. The roads between Old Faithful and West Yellowstone had a nice 4-foot wide shoulder. Even with the high level of traffic, the relatively flat and downhill grade made for easy pedaling. The countryside was scenic with low mountain ranges, with buffalo herds, and with the Madison River flowing near the road. As we left, we had a surprise visitor at our cabins. Midway Geyser Basin was our first stop.
Here we are at Midway Geyser Basin.
Yep.
The spectacular geyser to our right is prismatic geyser. Can't see either one, there's so much steam.
Because it's so cold like that, too. Maybe because the sun,
Don't move yet. You're by return point.
Video on there.
Yeah.
Take pictures. This is pretty impressive too.
Uh-huh. I didn't see this when we came here earlier.
White Dome Geyser was located only a few feet from Firehole Lake Drive. Its 12-foot-high geyserite cone was one of the largest in the park. It had unpredictable eruptions, typically every 20 or 35 minutes, that lasted around 2 to 3 minutes and spurt about 30 feet high. Firehole Lake was a small pond next to the road. It was fed by 2 small and continuously spurting geysers. The water was reportedly ejected at approximately 160 degrees. Bruce decided to check this out for himself in the runoff next to the road.
Go for it.
About 20 feet downstream from the Firehole River outlet. At Firehole Lake. Still too hot to hot tub in.
Too hot?
It may be 118.
118. Okay. So you wouldn't swim in this, huh? No. Okay.
Leaving the park near Madison Campground, Madison River formed a marshy plain between the road and the edge aside of Firestone Canyon. It was a frequent hangout for buffalo herds. Approaching West Yellowstone, the countryside flattened out for some easy pedaling. Every trip had a few dark clouds. Ours arrived as we settled into our motel for the evening. Day 6 was a shock. Lows of 12 degrees and highs in the 40s. It didn't actually snow, but the ride got canceled. Instead, we did laundry, watched a couple of IMAX movies, and enjoyed some of the local cuisine. We found a 50s restaurant with huckleberry milkshakes, and Bobby from Tennessee found us. Always be careful when out of town. You never know who might be watching. The next day was forecasted with highs in the low 60s. The group was back on bikes. The plan was to ride 60 miles to Ashton, Idaho, with stops at Angler's Restaurant for lunch and Mesa Falls for touring. The road was great. Some in the group announced that they thought this day was the best ride thus far. We didn't get too far before we had the only flat on the trip. The 7,000-foot Continental Divide was at the border of Montana with Idaho. After Dunraven Pass, it was hardly noticeable. Wide shoulders, light traffic, and the great scenery was the ultimate pleasure for a touring bicyclist. Angler's Lodge was right on Blue Spring Creek, where we watched fly fishermen while we had lunch. The whole lodge was ours. None of us had an idea about what to expect at Mesa Falls. It was spectacular.
That is kind of impressive.
Put my strap around my hand just in case I should slip.
Exactly.
Wow. Is almost as impressive as the Niagara Falls.
You know, I'm starting to think that might actually be worth the 400-foot climb up.
Yeah. Rankin was a good choice for the evening stay. We nearly had the place to ourselves, and the owner had a fire pit waiting on our arrival. He preferred talking to each person as he arrived instead of checking in. 40-mile ride from Ashton to Driggs was tougher than expected. The first part of the route was pucky, not big hills, just a constant roll. Some of the roads were on hard-packed gravel, which made travel a little tenuous. Around halfway, the group came upon a steep downhill, which became an impromptu challenge to see who could coast the furthest without pedaling. Near Totonia, the route flattened out, and it became a snack time instead of lunchtime. Finally, around mid-afternoon, everyone made it to the motel at the outskirts of Driggs. From here, some pedaled around town to explore, and others caught an early dinner at a nearby Mexican restaurant. At the beginning of the route, the road was flat but pucky, and with virtually no traffic. We had a brief stop near a potato farm. Then, to add a little adventure, the young'uns proposed a downhill challenge. From the west side, the setting sun cast a red glow on the peaks of the Teton mountain range. The last day received a lot of discussion. The climb up Teton Pass to 8,500 feet was steep with narrow shoulders and with miles at 10% or higher grade. The 5-mile long downhill averaged greater than a 10% grade. Sharing this road with any significant motor traffic could be quite hazardous. Non-bicyclist family members insisted that we not do the downhill. The 8-mile route from Driggs to Victor was on a flat paved bike trail. The next 10 miles were on a road having a decent shoulder. The 8-mile climb was not so bicycle friendly. The 5-mile long downhill was a screamer, as suspected. At the bottom, the route continued on Moose Wilson Bike Trail for 8 miles to Teton Village. After lunch at the Mangy Moose, the route continued on Moose Wilson Road into Grand Teton Park, and lastly on Jackson Bike Trail back to Elk Refuge Motel. The climb was tough, but not as bad as we initially anticipated. The worst part was a 10% grade on the last 3 miles near the top. Andrew was king of the mountain, followed by Dean. Andrew, Ann, Ben, Brian, and Dean made the plunge without killing themselves. Then Dean had Sharon ferry him back up the mountain in the van so he could do it again. At the bottom of Teton Pass was the paved Moose Wilson bike trail. It provided 8 miles of easy pedaling to Teton Village, which is hugely popular for snow skiing. Our plans to ride the Grand Teton Park got canceled by the park rangers. Bears were feeding in the area, not necessary on bicyclists, but we headed back down the bike trail to Jackson anyway. The adventure ended with an ice cream sandwich at the Elk Refuge Motel.